Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are zooming out, way, way out. We're looking at an event that didn't just change a map, it really shifted the center of gravity for the entire planet.
It really did. I mean, usually when we talk about the big earth-shattering revolutions of the 20th century, the Western mind just goes straight to Russia in 1917.
Right, the Bolsheviks, the Winter Palace, all those guys in greatcoats storming the gates. It's the classic image.
But the source material we are unpacking today argues that, well, we might be looking at the wrong revolution if we want to understand the modern world. We're talking about the Chinese Revolution.
Which is such a massive topic. I mean, this is the event that leads to Mao Zedong's famous declaration that the Chinese people had stood up.
Exactly. And the argument here, this is from the book Storming the Heavens,
Yeah.
Mao, the Peasantry and Chinese Revolution by Jenny Clegg, is that this wasn't just a regime change. This was the moment that ended almost 5 centuries of European and settler colonial dominance over the globe.
That is a huge claim. 5 centuries of history just overturned in a couple of decades.
It is. It shifted the balance of power in a way we're still feeling right now. But here's the thing. Clegg treats this book almost like a detective story. She's not just recounting dates and battles. She's trying to solve a very specific historical mystery that, on paper, makes no sense.
And that mystery, that's the mission of our deep dive today. Because according to the rule book everyone was using in the 1920s and 30s, this revolution should have failed. Miserably.
It should have been impossible. You have a communist party whose entire ideology is based on industrial urban workers trying to lead a revolution in a country that's like almost all peasants.
And that rule book, traditional Marxist theory, it wasn't exactly kind to peasants.
Not at all. And that's the hook. How did a revolution succeed when the main characters, the peasants, were the very people the theory said were vacillating, conservative, and totally incapable of representing themselves?
I love that setup. We're looking at how they basically threw out the manual and wrote a new one in real time. So let's start there with the manual. Why was a peasant revolution such a paradox for a Marxist?
Well, you have to go back to Marx himself. His vision of revolution was strictly proletarian. He was looking at Manchester, at Berlin. He saw the urban factory worker, someone who owned nothing, had no property, and worked in a collective environment, as the engine of history.
The people with nothing to lose but their chains. That's the famous line.
Right. But when Marx looked at the countryside, he saw something very different. He famously compared peasants to a sack of potatoes.
A sack of potatoes? Ouch. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement.
No, it wasn't meant to be. He meant they were just a bunch of individuals, thrown together in a sack. They didn't have a collective consciousness. They were isolated on their little plots of land. He saw them as a bastion of social conservatism.
So if you're a strict Marxist in the 1920s, you're thinking the peasants are the ones who want to keep things the same. They want to protect their little plot of land, their traditions. They're not trying to overthrow the global order.
Precisely. They're looking backward, not forward. And yet, Clegg's book argues the Chinese Revolution completely flipped this on its head. In China, the peasants weren't just participants. They were the main revolutionary force. But figuring out how to mobilize them, that was the source of a massive fight in the international communist world.
And this is the whole Stalin versus Trotsky debate the source gets into.
The elephant in the room, you can't talk about this period without it. They're sitting in Moscow looking at China and giving completely different advice.
Okay, so lay it out for us. What was Stalin's take on the situation in China?
Stalin was pushing for what's called a united front. He looked at China and said, look, this is a feudal country dominated by foreign imperialists. The immediate problem isn't capitalism, it's foreign control.
So the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Basically, yeah. He believed the Chinese communists should ally with the national bourgeoisie.
Okay, let's pause on that term because it comes up a lot. National bourgeoisie. We're talking about Chinese business owners, right?
Correct. But specifically the domestic ones who wanted China to be independent. These weren't the compradors, the agents for the British or Americans. These were local factory owners being crushed by foreign companies. So Stalin saw them as a revolutionary force because they were anti-imperialist.
Makes sense. So Stalin says, team up with the local capitalists to kick out the foreigners. What did Trotsky say?
Trotsky was much more skeptical. He said, no way. He argued that these national bourgeoisie were just agents of foreign capital in disguise, or, at least too weak to stand up to them. He didn't trust them. He thought if you allied with them, they'd just betray the workers and peasants the first chance they got.
So you've got these two titans of communism giving opposite advice. Who was right?
Well, according to Clegg, neither of them quite nailed it. And this is where the source suggests Mao Zedong's insight was so crucial. Mao realized the reality was more nuanced than either Stalin or Trotsky thought.
The Goldilocks zone of analysis.
In a way, yeah. Mao argued that the national bourgeoisie vacillated. That is the key word here. They were stuck in the middle.
Vacillating, so they couldn't make up their minds. They were just indecisive.
It's less about personality and more about their conflicting interests. Yes, they were anti-imperialist because foreign companies were crushing them. They wanted an independent China so they could make money. But, and this is a huge but, they were also terrified of the masses. If the peasants rose up, the business owners got scared they'd lose their property.
So they'd swing back and forth. When the foreigners squeezed them, they'd side with the revolution. But when the peasants got too rowdy, they'd run back to the reactionaries.
Exactly. It's not about good guys or bad guys. It's about groups acting in their own self-interest, depending on the pressure they're under. And to understand that pressure, we have to look at the economy. Clegg uses this really evocative term, twisted growth.
Twisted growth. It sounds like a plant trying to grow around a rock.
That's a perfect analogy. Imperialism had distorted China's development. You had these Chinese national capitalists, but they were incredibly weak. They relied on loans from foreign banks. They couldn't compete with cheap foreign goods flooding the market.
So they were stuck. They couldn't grow naturally.
Right. And here's the kicker. To survive, these urban businesses needed land reform.
Wait, why? Why would a factory owner in Shanghai care about land reform in a village 500 miles away?
Because they needed customers. If the peasants are starving and paying all their money to landlords, they aren't buying shoes or pots and pans. You need a domestic market.
Ah, I get it. So the capitalists actually needed the peasants to have more money just so the whole economy could function.
Precisely. But, and this is the twisted part, these business owners were too weak to lead that reform. And often, they owned land themselves back in the villages, so they were caught in this trap. They needed the peasantry to rise up to save the economy, but they were terrified of what would happen if the peasantry actually did rise up.
And that brings us to the friction between the city and the country. The source mentions some pretty intense examples. It wasn't just a theoretical disagreement. It was happening on the roads.
Oh, it was very physical. You have to imagine the scene. The cities are demanding grain, but the peasants are living right on the margins of subsistence. If they ship their grain out, they might starve. So you had instances where peasants would literally block the roads.
They were keeping the food in the villages just to survive.
Yes, and the urban reformers, the intellectuals in the city, they looked at this and they didn't see people trying to survive. They saw peasant backwardness. They thought, these country bumpkins are ruining our modernization.
That disconnect is huge. It's like two different countries sharing the same space.
It gets worse. When the peasants did revolt, they didn't do it by half measures. The source describes how, in some of these rural upsurges, the peasants would confiscate everything.
The list in the text is wild. Oxen, manure, plows, and pigs.
Everything for public use. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a small business owner in the city, that national bourgeoisie we talked about. Maybe your family still owns a small farm back in the village. You hear that the peasants are seizing the manure and the pigs.
I panic. I'm thinking, they're coming for my shop next.
Exactly. You panic. This terror is what caused the 1927 revolution to fall apart. The national bourgeoisie got scared, sided with the landlords and the foreign powers, and crushed the communists.
So the breakdown happened because the communists couldn't figure out how to keep the peasants fighting for freedom without scaring the business owners into the arms of the enemy.
That is the central dilemma. How do you thread that needle? How do you mobilize the poor without terrifying the middle?
And the book calls this a lengthy trial and error process. It wasn't like they had a master plan from day one. They messed up a lot.
They really, really did. And this is the part of the book I found most fascinating. Clegg breaks these errors down into two main categories: rightist errors and leftist errors. And understanding these is key to understanding how they eventually won.
Okay, let's start with the rightist errors. When did that happen?
This usually happened when the Communist Party was trying to play nice. So, for example, during the war against Japan, they needed everyone on the same side to fight the invaders. So the party gave a lot of leeway to capitalist interests and the rich peasants.
To keep the peace. Don't rock the boat while we're fighting a war.
Right. They adopted what was called the middle peasant line. They focused on helping the peasants who were already producing a surplus, the ones who were doing okay.
But that leaves out the poorest people. The ones with nothing.
It totally ignored the poor.
Yeah.
So the people at the bottom felt betrayed. They felt like the revolution wasn't for them. That's the rightist error. compromising too much and losing your base.
Okay, so then they realize that's not working, and they swing the other way, the leftist error.
This happens when the alliance breaks down. The party decides to go hard. They adopt the poor peasant line. And this is where you get the slogan mentioned in the book. To everyone land, a house, and a horse.
Which honestly sounds great if you don't have a house or a horse. It sounds like the ultimate promise of communism.
It sounds like a perfect slogan.
Yeah.
Absolute egalitarianism. Everyone gets the same. But here's the problem. In reality, where do those horses come from?
You have to take them from someone.
You have to take them. And to give everyone a horse and a house, you start dipping into the pockets not just of the landlords, but of the middle peasants.
Okay, we need to clarify who these middle peasants are. These aren't the feudal lords.
No, and that's the crucial distinction. The feudal lords are the 1% who own everything. The middle peasants are the backbone of the rural economy. They're families who maybe have their own plow, maybe an ox, and they work their own land. They aren't really exploiting anyone, but they aren't destitute either.
So if you enforce absolute equality, the middle peasant looks at his neighbor, who maybe didn't work as hard, and sees him getting the same stuff. Or worse, the middle peasant has his own ox taken away to be shared.
Precisely. This absolute equality terrified the middle peasants. And this is a huge social layer. We're talking tens of millions of people. If you alienate them, they run to the landlords for protection. Suddenly, the revolution loses its mass support.
It's fascinating that equality, which we think of as the ultimate goal, can actually be a strategic mistake if it drives away the people you need as allies.
That's one of the key takeaways from Clegg's analysis. The leftist error was moving too fast, too radically, and isolating the party. It was, pure ideologically, but disastrous strategically.
And the source mentions some specific studies that document this, right? This isn't just high-level theory.
Right. Clegg cites these classic works like 10 Mile Inn by David and Isabel Crook and Fanchon by William Hinton. These were people on the ground, living in the villages, documenting these policy swings. They watched the party try one thing, fail, try another, fail, eventually learn.
So let's get to the solution, the winning formula. How do you please the poor peasant who wants land, the middle peasant who wants to keep what they've earned, and the city business owner who wants grain? It just seems impossible to make all three happy.
It does, but the strategy they landed on is, well, it's brilliant in its pragmatism. They moved away from absolute egalitarianism.
So not everyone gets a horse.
Not everyone gets a horse. The outcome of the successful land reform was actually uneven distribution.
This sounds so counterintuitive for a communist revolution. You expect everyone to get an equal slice of the pie. Walk us through how that worked.
Okay. So for the poor peasants, the destitute, they established a subsistence guarantee. They got enough land to survive. That was the baseline. No one starves.
Okay, that secures the base. The poor are on board because they're eating.
Then you look at the middle peasants. They received less land than the poor in the redistribution because they already had some. But, and this is crucial, the policy was designed to lift them from just barely surviving to becoming surplus producers. They were encouraged to make money.
So they weren't punished for doing well.
Exactly. And even the rich peasants, the layer just below the landlords, were encouraged to keep their wealth if they invested in production.
Instead of what? What were they doing with it before?
Feudal land speculation. In the old system, if you made money, you just bought more land and rented it out. You became a parasite. The communists said, no, keep your money, but build a mill, buy better tools, invest in the actual economy.
I see. So they shifted the entire incentive structure. You can be rich, but you have to be productive rich, not rent-seeking rich.
Ideally, yes. And then to bind the poor and middle peasants together, they created mutual aid teams.
What does that look like in practice?
It's just sharing labor and tools. The poor peasant might not have a plow, but he has strong arms. The middle peasant has a plow but needs help with the harvest. They work together. This created a web of economic dependency between the poor and the middle classes.
So they needed each other. It wasn't just, we are all peasants. It was, I can't harvest my crop without you.
They needed each other. And here's the aha moment. By creating this block, this unity between the poor and the middle, they completely isolated the feudal landlords.
The landlords had no one left to turn to.
Exactly. The middle peasants weren't running to the landlords anymore because the revolution was letting them prosper. The poor peasants weren't running to the landlords because they had their own land now. The landlords were just cut off socially and politically.
That is a masterclass in coalition building. But what about the cities? Those nervous business owners we talked about, the national bourgeoisie. How did this solve their problem?
And this is the final piece of the puzzle. By stabilizing the countryside, the grain started flowing again. The blocking of the roads stopped. The supply lines to the cities were secure.
So the business owners in the cities saw that the communists could actually, run the country.
Exactly. The communists did what the urban reformers couldn't.
Yeah.
They stabilized the supply chain. This regained the confidence of the national bourgeoisie. They realized, okay, these guys aren't going to take my shop tomorrow. They're actually going to fix the market so I can sell my goods.
That is such a complex balancing act. It's basically threading a needle between 3 or 4 different class interests all at the same time.
It is. And that's why Clegg argues that the revolution succeeded. Not because of brute force, and not because peasants were naturally revolutionary, but because the Communist Party, through rigorous analysis and a lot of painful trial and error, built a winning alliance.
So wrapping this up, the book Storming the Heavens isn't really just a history book about China. It's a study in strategy.
It really is. Clegg's main thesis is that this success came from tactical flexibility. They didn't stick to a rigid dogma when it wasn't working. They analyzed the classes, figured out who could be united, and then managed the contradictions.
And the source mentions a broader lesson here. Even for people who aren't planning a revolution in 1940s China, it explicitly mentions British socialists.
Right. The book notes that the slogan to everyone land, a house, and a horse might not address a modern British worker's most pressing needs.
Probably not. Where would you even keep the horse in a London apartment? The zoning laws alone would be a nightmare.
Exactly. But the challenge remains the same. The source reflects on how difficult it is to build alliances within a working class that has significant gradations.
Gradations meaning, like, differences in wealth.
Yes. You have people who are barely scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck. And then you have people who are technically workers. They have a boss, they earn a wage, but they own a home, maybe have some savings, maybe a retirement fund.
And often those two groups just don't see eye to eye.
Correct. The middle peasant of today might be someone with a mortgage and a steady salary job. The poor peasant might be someone in the gig economy with zero security. The lesson from China is that if you try to enforce a policy that makes that middle group feel threatened, like you're dragging them down to the level of the gig worker, you lose. You have to find a policy that lifts the bottom while securing the middle.
That's a powerful parallel. It's about cement. How do you cement unity despite differences?
Precisely. And Clegg suggests that Mao emerges from this not just as a figurehead, but as a brilliant strategist, specifically because of his ability to navigate these contradictions over 25 years. He understood you can't just wish away the differences between people. You have to build a structure that accommodates them.
Which brings us to the final thought for you, our listeners. We started by talking about how this revolution shifted the global balance of power. But looking at the mechanics of it, it leaves us with a lingering question about our own time.
It does. In any major societal shift, whether it's political, technological, or economic, there is always a middle peasant. There's always a large swing group that is doing okay, but feels precarious.
The group that essentially decides the winner.
Right. So the question is, in the conflicts we see today, who are the middle peasants? And are the movements trying to change the world alienating them or embracing them? Because as we saw with the Chinese Revolution, that decision usually determines history.
Something to think about next time you're reading the headlines. That's it for this deep dive into Storming the Heavens. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.